In the autumn of 1943, a photographer working for the British government in Calcutta captured an image that would haunt history. It showed a skeletal woman lying on the pavement, her ribs visible through her skin, too weak to move. Beside her, a dog sniffed at her body, already assuming she was dead. She wasn't, not yet. Around her, thousands of other figures lay in similar states of collapse. The streets of Calcutta had become an open-air morgue. This was the Bengal famine of 1943, and it would kill approximately 3 million people. But here's what the photograph doesn't show you. Just a few miles away, British-controlled warehouses were stocked with rice. In the countryside, grain merchants were hoarding supplies, waiting for prices to rise. Ships filled with food sailed past the starving ports of Bengal, destined for British soldiers. In Europe and the Middle East, the famine was not caused by a failure of crops. It was caused by a failure of policy. It was not an act of God, it was an act of empire. This is the story of how Britain starved India to feed its war machine, and how Winston Churchill, the man celebrated as a defender of freedom, let 3 million people die because their lives were worth less than military logistics. To understand what happened in Bengal in 1943, you have to understand the nature of British rule in India. For nearly 2 centuries, India had been the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. It was the source of immense wealth, providing raw materials, markets, and tax revenue that fueled British power. But the relationship was entirely extractive. India did not benefit from this arrangement. The British did. By the 20th century, India was trapped in a colonial economic system designed to serve British interests. Indian farmers were forced to grow cash. Crops like cotton and indigo for export rather than food for their own families. The tax system was brutal, draining wealth from the countryside into the coffers of the Raj. Famines were not new in British India. They were frequent and deadly. Between 1765 and 1947, India suffered approximately 25 major famines. Estimates suggest that between 30 and 60 million Indians died in these famines under British rule. These were not natural disasters. They were policy failures, the result of a system that prioritized profit over people. When drought or crop failure occurred, the British administration's response was often inadequate or non-existent. The free market ideology of the 19th and early 20th centuries held that government intervention in food distribution was wrong. The market would correct itself, they believed. Millions starved while the market corrected. But the Bengal famine of 1943 was different. It occurred not during peacetime neglect, but during the Second World War, when the resources of the empire were being mobilized for total war. And the decisions made by the British government during this famine were not just neglect. They were active choices that prioritized military needs over civilian lives. The roots of the 1943 famine began in 1942. In that year, Japan was advancing rapidly through Southeast Asia. They had conquered Malaya, Singapore, and were threatening Burma, which was then part of British India. Burma was a major rice-producing region, and Bengal had traditionally imported rice from Burma to supplement its own production. When the Japanese occupied Burma in early 1942, this supply was cut off. Bengal lost access to approximately 15% of its rice supply. This was a serious problem, but it was not yet a catastrophe. Bengal still had its own rice production, and there were reserves in other parts of India that could have been redirected. But instead of addressing the supply shortage, the British government made it worse. They implemented a policy called the denial policy. The logic was simple and brutal. The British military was terrified that the Japanese would invade Bengal. If that happened, the British wanted to ensure that the Japanese would find no food, no boats, and no resources to sustain their advance. So the government ordered the destruction of rice stocks in coastal areas. They confiscated boats to prevent the Japanese from using them to navigate the river systems. Tens of thousands of small fishing and transport boats were seized or destroyed. This devastated the rural economy. Fishermen lost their livelihoods. Farmers lost the ability to transport their goods to market. But most importantly, the confiscation of boats meant that when food shortages began, there was no way to move rice from surplus areas to deficit areas. The infrastructure that could have prevented a famine was deliberately destroyed by the British to deny it to an enemy that never came. The Japanese never invaded Bengal, but the policy remained in place. The damage was done. At the same time, the British were implementing a system of prioritization for food distribution. This system was designed to ensure that certain groups received adequate food supplies while others did not. The priority groups were British soldiers, Indian soldiers serving the British, civil servants, industrial workers in war industries, and workers in the cities, particularly Calcutta, which was a strategic military hub. The lowest priority group was the rural peasantry of Bengal. These were the people who actually grew the rice. They were the ones deemed expendable. The system was called the Boat Denial and Rice Denial Scheme, and it was enforced by the military and the provincial government. The result was predictable. The rural areas of Bengal were stripped of food to feed the cities and the military. When the next rice harvest in late 1942 was smaller than expected due to a cyclone and flooding, the shortage became acute, but it was still manageable. There was rice in India. The problem was distribution and priority. Throughout 1943, as reports of starvation began to filter in from the countryside, the British administration in India requested emergency food imports from other parts of the empire. They asked for grain from Australia. They asked for wheat from Canada. They asked for rice from Southeast Asia, but most of that region was under Japanese control. These requests went to the War Cabinet in London, and ultimately to one man, Winston Churchill. Churchill was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the architect of Britain's war strategy. He was also a man with a deep and well-documented contempt for India and Indians. Churchill was an unrepentant imperialist. He believed in the racial superiority of the British and viewed the colonized peoples as inferior. His views on India were particularly venomous. He had opposed Indian independence for decades. He had said that he hated Indians, that they were a beastly people with a beastly religion. In 1943, when his own officials warned him that millions were dying in Bengal, Churchill's response was not to rush aid. It was to ask why Gandhi hadn't died yet. The War Cabinet met repeatedly throughout. In 1943, to discuss the Bengal situation, the Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, and later his successor, Lord Wavell, sent urgent cables to London requesting food shipments. They warned that people were dying in massive numbers. They begged for emergency grain supplies. Churchill refused. His reasoning was cold and strategic. Britain was fighting a total war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Every ship, every ton of grain, every logistical resource was allocated to the war effort. Shipping food to India would require diverting merchant ships from other routes. It would mean taking ships away from supplying British and American troops in Europe and the Middle East. Churchill made a calculation. Feeding starving Indians was less important than maintaining military supply lines. He argued that the famine was exaggerated, that Indians were hoarding food, and that the problem was not a lack of food, but a failure of distribution within India. He placed the blame on Indian grain merchants and provincial administrators. This was partially true. There was hoarding, and there was profiteering. Merchants did hold back rice to drive up prices, making enormous profits while people starved. But this was a symptom of the crisis, not the cause. The British government had the power to requisition grain, to control prices, and to organize distribution. They chose not to exercise that power in Bengal. Instead, they focused their efforts on securing food for the cities and the military, while the rural population was left to die. The famine reached its peak in the summer and autumn of 1943. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes of unimaginable horror. In the villages of Bengal, entire families lay dead in their homes. The fields were full of corpses, too many to bury. Survivors described the stages of starvation. First, people sold their possessions to buy food. They sold their jewelry, their tools, their cattle. When those were gone, they sold their land. When they had nothing left to sell, they begged. When begging failed, they died. Children died first, then the elderly, then the adults. Mothers watched their children waste away, unable to help. The social fabric disintegrated. There were reports of people eating grass, leaves, and the bark of trees. There were reports of cannibalism, though these were rare and disputed. What is certain is that the famine destroyed communities. It destroyed families. It destroyed lives. The death toll is difficult to calculate precisely because record-keeping in rural Bengal was poor. The most commonly cited figure is 3 million deaths, though some historians argue it could be higher. For context, 3 million is more than the total British military and civilian deaths in the entire Second World War. It is comparable to the death toll of the Holocaust in Poland. It happened in a single region, in a single year, while the British government controlled the territory and had the resources to prevent it. The city of Calcutta became a magnet for the starving. People from the countryside walked for days or weeks to reach the city, hoping to find food or relief. Instead, they found streets filled with other starving refugees. The British authorities, fearing that the sight of mass death would harm morale and encourage unrest, organized sweeps to remove the bodies. Trucks would drive through the streets at night, collecting the dead and dumping them in mass graves or cremation pits. The exact number of bodies removed this way is unknown, but estimates run into the hundreds of thousands. The British censorship apparatus worked hard to suppress news of the famine. Journalists were restricted in their reporting. Photographs like the one described at the beginning of this story were often suppressed or not widely published. The British government did not want the world, or even the British public, to know the full extent of what was happening. They feared that it would damage the moral authority of the empire and provide propaganda material for the Axis powers. In London, Churchill continued to resist calls for emergency aid. In July 1943, Secretary of State for India Leo Amory wrote in his diary that Churchill's attitude toward India was negligent, hostile, and contemptuous. Amory himself was no friend of Indian independence, but even he was horrified by Churchill's refusal to act. When Amory raised the issue in cabinet meetings, Churchill would dismiss it or change the subject. On one occasion, when officials warned that people were dying, Churchill reportedly said that if the famine was so bad, why hadn't Gandhi died yet? On another occasion, when told that the famine was the worst disaster in India in decades, Churchill is reported to have said that it was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. These statements, while disputed by some Churchill apologists, are consistent with his documented views and actions. Whether or not he said those exact words, his policies spoke louder. He refused to divert ships. He refused to release grain reserves from Australia or Canada. He continued to build up stockpiles in Britain and the Mediterranean in case of a future invasion or supply disruption, even though those stockpiles were far beyond what was needed. Meanwhile, ships loaded with grain from Australia sailed past India to supply British troops in the Balkans and the Middle East. The SS Talawa, for example, left Australia in November 1942, carrying a large shipment of grain destined for the Middle East. It was torpedoed and sunk by a Japanese submarine, and the grain went to the bottom of the ocean. If that grain had been diverted to Bengal, thousands of lives could have been saved. It was not until late 1943 and early 1944, when the famine had already killed millions, that the British government finally began to take significant action. The new viceroy, Lord Wavell, who took office in October 1943, was appalled by what he found. Wavell was a military man, not a politician, and he approached the famine as a logistical problem to be solved. He organized emergency food distribution. He brought in the military to manage relief efforts. He pressured London to release grain reserves. Slowly, the situation began to stabilize. By mid-1944, the famine was over. The death had stopped, not because the harvest improved dramatically, but because the government finally intervened. The contrast is damning. When the British government decided to act, they had the resources and the organizational capacity to end the famine relatively quickly. The fact that they waited so long proves that the famine was a choice. It was not inevitable. It was the result of priorities. British lives and British military objectives were prioritized over Indian lives. This was not a secret conspiracy. It was official policy. After the war, there were inquiries into the famine. The Famine Inquiry Commission, established by the British government, published its report in 1945. The report acknowledged that the famine was man-made. It identified failures in government policy, the hoarding of grain by merchants, and the breakdown of distribution systems. But it avoided directly blaming the British War Cabinet or Winston Churchill. The tone of the report was bureaucratic, focusing on technical failures rather than moral responsibility. The report was largely forgotten. In Britain, the famine was not taught in schools. It was not part of the national memory of the war. The narrative of World War II in Britain was, and remains, heroic. Britain stood alone against Nazi tyranny. Churchill was the lion who saved civilization. The uncomfortable fact that this same government presided over a famine that killed 3 million people in its own colony was inconvenient. It did not fit the story. In India, however, the famine became a symbol of the brutality of British rule. Indian nationalists used it as evidence that the British were not fit to govern India. The famine strengthened the independence movement. It radicalized a generation of Indians who had seen their families starve while the British hoarded grain. When India finally gained independence in 1947, the memory of the Bengal famine was one of the grievances that justified the end of empire. The famine also had long-term economic and social effects. The rural economy of Bengal was devastated. Landless laborers and small farmers were driven into debt and poverty from which many never recovered. The famine disrupted traditional social structures. It created a generation of orphans and widows. It left psychological scars that persisted for decades. The famine also contributed to the partition of India in 1947. Bengal, already weakened by the famine, was divided between India and the newly created Pakistan. The eastern part became East Pakistan, which would later become Bangladesh after another war in 1971. The region's economic and social instability, rooted in part in the trauma of the famine, played a role in the violence and chaos of partition. Today, the Bengal famine is studied by historians as a case study in how famines are not natural disasters, but political and economic events. The economist Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on famine, grew up in Bengal during the famine. He witnessed the starvation firsthand. His research showed that famines rarely occur because of an absolute shortage of food. They occur because of a failure of distribution, a failure of entitlement, and a failure of governance. In the case of Bengal, there was enough food in India to feed the population. But the British government chose to prioritize military needs over civilian needs, and they chose to protect the food security of British and Allied troops at the expense of Indian lives. The Bengal famine also raises difficult questions about Winston Churchill's legacy. In the West, Churchill is rightly celebrated for his leadership during the war, for his defiance of Hitler, and for his role in the Allied victory. But this heroic image is incomplete. Churchill was also an imperialist who believed in the racial hierarchy of empire. His decisions during the Bengal famine were consistent with that worldview. He did not see Indian lives as equal to British lives. He made a calculation that 3 million Indian deaths were an acceptable price to pay for British military success. This does not erase his achievements in the war against Nazi Germany, but it complicates the narrative. History is not a simple story of heroes and villains. It is a story of choices and consequences. Churchill made choices in 1943 that saved British soldiers and secured Allied supply lines. But those same choices killed millions of Indians. Both things are true. The famine is also a reminder of the nature of empire. Empires are systems of extraction. They take wealth, resources, and labor from the colonized and transfer it to the colonizer. When the interests of the empire and the interests of the colonized population conflict, the empire chooses its own interests. This is not a moral failing of individual leaders, though individual leaders bear responsibility for their decisions. It is a structural feature of imperialism. The British Empire was not unique in this regard. All empires operate on similar logic. But the Bengal famine is one of the clearest examples in modern history of how that logic works in practice. There is a final bitter irony to the story. The food that was denied to Bengal was used to build up massive stockpiles in Britain and the Middle East in preparation for future military operations. Some of these stockpiles were never used. After the war ended in 1945, the British government found itself with enormous surplus grain reserves. They sold some of it on the international market. They destroyed some of it because it had spoiled in storage. The grain that could have saved millions of lives in Bengal ended up rotting in warehouses or being sold for profit. This is not a story that Britain likes to remember. It is not a story that fits comfortably into the narrative of the good, war. But it is a story that needs to be told because it reveals the true cost of empire. The Bengal famine was not an accident. It was not an unfortunate side effect of war. It was a deliberate policy choice. The British government, led by Winston Churchill, decided that Indian lives were expendable. They decided that feeding their own soldiers and maintaining their own stockpiles was more important than preventing mass starvation in their own colony, and 3 million people died as a result. The photographs of skeletal figures lying in the streets of Calcutta are a testament to that choice. They are a reminder that empires are built not just on conquest and trade, but on suffering. The wealth and power of the British Empire in the 20th century was purchased, in part with the lives of the people of Bengal. The famine of 1943 was the price of empire, and the bill was paid in blood. Subscribe now and stay ahead. When history is written, you'll be one of the few who saw it coming. If you think there's something we missed or a topic you want us to cover, let's discuss it in the comments.